Right, I'm sure others will be joining shortly in due course, but I think we'll make a start just in the interest of trying to keep to time scales. So good morning, everybody. My name's Oliver McCann. I'm a partner in the employment and HR team at Knapton Solicitors. I'm very pleased that you've joined us today for today's session on domestic abuse and why it should be on an employer's agenda. I'll be hosting the session today, and I'm delighted to welcome Shagufta Khan and Rebecca Wilson from the Wish Centre, a charity based in Blackburn that supports victims of domestic abuse, providing a whole range of support services, including providing information on and securing a safe refuge for victims of domestic abuse, as well as having independent domestic abuse advocates who will provide one-to-one support to victims of domestic abuse, including sort of helping them create safety plans and risk assessments. I'm sure Shagufta or Rebecca will provide more detail on the whole range of services they provide, but it will be helpful, I think, to set the scene really to understand a little bit more about domestic abuse and the impact it has on victims and potentially the impact it has on the wider economy and on employers. So on that basis, I'm going to pass over to Rebecca and Shagufta, who will take you through sort of what the Wish Centre does and how they support victims and what it means for employers. And then afterwards, I will sort of look at it a little bit more from an employment and HR slant, and then we'll move on to some Q&A. So if I can pass over to Rebecca and Shagufta, thank you.
Hi, thank you. We'll share this. There we go. So hi, thank you Knaptons for inviting us here today. I'm Rebecca, and Shagufta here is our CEO at the Wish Centre. And hopefully by the end of today's presentation, everyone will understand why domestic abuse really is everybody's business. It isn't something that should be ignored or not spoken about. It's something that needs to be out in the open and needs to be dealt with in the best and safest way possible. I'm going to start by, so when I talk about domestic abuse through the whole of the slides, I'm talking about all types of domestic abuse. It isn't just physical. There's sexual there, sexual abuse, financial abuse, emotional and psychological abuse. The list of examples that I've given here, they are not exhaustive. There are many ways that can be specific to a specific victim, many ways that someone can be abused. And we need to remember that abuse also includes digital and technical abuse, so tracking on phones, trackers can be put on phones, people taking over other people's social media accounts, forced marriage, FGM, honour-based violence, and stalking and harassment, which is one that can often be seen quite regularly at work if it's taking place. And I think it's important to point out at this moment that stalking and harassment, I know that there's a lot of this, oh, he's stalking you or she's stalking you. Actually, stalking and harassment is one of the highest risk behaviours. 50% of stalkers will carry out any threats that they make, so it really is a very high risk behaviour. And again, just some basics. Domestic abuse is very common, so 1 in 3 women at some point in their life will be impacted by domestic abuse. It is that common. So I don't know how many women are on this call, but you know, 1 in 3 women will be impacted. And whilst we do not dispute it happens to men, there are male victims, absolutely, we acknowledge that. It is still a very gendered crime, sadly. 92.1% of defendants were male and 7.9% female, so that's perpetrators. Looking at it from the victim side, 83% of victims are female against 16% of male victims. So we do accept that there are male victims, absolutely. And again, it can happen to anyone. Race, gender, class, what job you work, none of it is a protective factor. It happens to all walks of life, anyone in any walk of life. So a domestic abuse call is taken by the police every 30 seconds across the country. So that's huge. But what we also need to remember is that the vast majority of incidents just aren't reported. So don't presume that if someone hasn't involved the police that they're not impacted by domestic abuse, because the vast majority aren't. And in fact, even women that come into refuge, about 1 in 5 even make the move to refuge without reporting to the police ever. So you know, numbers of reports to the police aren't a true indicator. The human impact obviously is immeasurable, but it does include mental health issues, financial issues, difficulties with childcare, physical health issues, which of course all impact on a person's ability to carry out their job effectively. The impact on employers, the knock-on effect of that on employers and productivity is huge. You can see there from the figures, 360 million is lost just as a result of work-related absences. That's not, you know, any other costs involved. That is purely the absences. The total cost is estimated to be about 1.9 billion. That figure, I have seen different figures mooted, but that seems to be the figure that's given most regularly. I suppose it would depend on what is being measured. And about 122,000 working women have taken time off work in the past year because of domestic abuse. And the average time taken either in sick leave or in arranged days off due to domestic abuse is about 10 days a year. So that's quite huge. You know, if you've got a member of staff that's having to take 10 sick days a year, that's going to have a huge impact, I'm sure. Sadly, domestic abuse can end in homicide. So a woman in the UK is killed on average about every 3 days. That has gone up since March 2020. There was a spell where it doubled, in fact. And 1 man is killed a month by a partner or former partner. So how does this impact you guys? Well, if someone, an employee, is murdered or is a murderer and it's a domestic abuse incident, you would be invited to take part in a domestic homicide review. These are a statutory meeting, a statutory panel, and everyone who has been involved, all the professionals been involved with that couple, would be invited and expected to take part. So the point of these domestic review homicides is to establish what lessons can be learned, identify clearly what is expected to change as a result of that incident, what policies can be put into place that are going to lead to potentially it not happening again in the future, and just to generally support victims of domestic abuse by making it safer for them. So the lessons to come out of it that can then be implemented going forward to help people so as to prevent another homicide, basically. This is a quote from a domestic homicide review that was published in January of this year. Now, Christina and her partner both worked for the same factory, and sadly, Christina left work one day, and unbeknown to her, her partner had left work earlier that day. she had separated from him, and she'd been advised by colleagues and friends to report it to the police because he was harassing her and stalking her. And she didn't report it to the police. But sadly, he left work early one day and waited for her in the garden of her property. She arrived home and he killed her. It was a stabbing incident. So everyone involved with Christina and the murderer was invited to the domestic homicide review. So the police and various agencies that were involved. Their employer was also invited to attend. And as you can see from the quote here, it would appear that their engagement was delayed. You know, so sadly, they hadn't kept any records of anything they knew. Nothing was recorded, and no steps had been taken by them to mitigate any harm coming to Christina. This meant that, you know, clearly Christina's family didn't have the answers that they needed to heal as a family, but also going forwards, that panel didn't know what lessons could have been learnt from those employers. So, you know, that's a missed opportunity, I think, to potentially save other people. Many domestic abuse victims work. I would say probably the vast majority of people experiencing domestic abuse are employed in some capacity. And, you know, employment can be a lifeline for these victims of abuse. It can be an opportunity to have a break from home. They need employment for the financial security. If they ever decide to leave, they need that financial security to be able to get away, you know, whether move into a different property or rent a property, you know, they need the financial security. Also, it can be for a victim who's isolated at home, isolated from friends and family, it can be the one opportunity to have a social life, you know, to talk to people, to be with other people other than the perpetrator. So many victims of domestic abuse will desperately want to continue work because that's their normality, that's part of their lifeline. Sadly, work resources can provide an opportunity for perpetrators. They know that they have to answer their work phone, they know that they have to answer their emails, they know where they will be. So, you know, if this is a case of stalking, they know that they will be at work, they know what hours they will be there, they know what entrance they come out, they know where they park their car. It makes it, being employed does make it very easy sometimes for a perpetrator of abuse. So colleagues, I mean, colleagues can be used, they can be threatened directly, or they can be used to pass on messages, or again, you know, the pressure on them may be feeling the need to cover for someone that they know is having a rough time, but they don't want to mention it to anyone because, well, no one knows what the reaction will be from the employer, from HR. So, you know, work resources really can be used by a perpetrator. So what can employers do to help anyone that's experiencing domestic abuse in the workplace? Well, the first thing I would suggest is an effective domestic abuse policy. So is everyone within the company knows that there is a policy in place, and if there is a member of staff that is experiencing domestic abuse or perpetrating domestic abuse, how it will be dealt with by the firm. It raises awareness of domestic abuse. It gives the impression that your company is understanding, it's a safe place, you know, to be able to disclose what's going on for them. it can that policy assigns roles and responsibilities. So before that person makes any kind of disclosure, they know exactly which member of staff is going to be dealing with this, who they're going to be talking to, what kind of records are going to be kept, are they going to be able to see the records, you know. So it's imperative that they know all that before they can build up the courage to come forward and say, look, I'm having some issues. Ensure that anyone who discloses to you is firstly believed. This coming forward takes immense courage. So, you know, they must be believed, and it must be handled with empathy and confidentiality. Again, I'm going to reiterate the keep accurate notes, because you never know when your notes are going to become vital for that person going forwards. They can be used, you know, they can be used to bolster a complaint to the police. They can be used as evidence when it comes to court proceedings for non-molestation orders, for residents or contact issues with the children. So, you know, keeping accurate notes is one of the best things that you could do for your employee. Commit to challenge a perpetrator if you believe that there is a perpetrator, or you know that there is a perpetrator on your workforce. Services are out there to support people who want to change their behaviour as well. So if they want to change their behaviour, there is help and support that they can get to do that. Make sure your policy and your ethos on domestic abuse is widely known. You know, make sure all your workforce knows exactly how, as employers, you feel about domestic abuse and supporting victims of domestic abuse. If there is capacity on your workforce, you could potentially also have one or however many employees you've got, a domestic abuse champion that receives specialist training. Most areas, excuse me, most areas have a local children's safeguarding board or some kind of safeguarding board where domestic abuse training is given. So, you know, do you have a member of staff that could become a domestic abuse champion that someone could go to for advice or support, or to get something off their chest, or to, you know, to support them in some way? I know Shagufta does the training for our local safeguarding board. Safety plan. If someone is being impacted by domestic abuse, help them safety plan around work. So can their work patterns be changed? Can they arrive later, perhaps? Maybe not earlier if they're going to be in an empty car park, but can they arrive later? You know, change their work times. Can they leave a little earlier? That kind of thing. Can, if a perpetrator is contacting them via email, via their work phone, can your IT put something in place that diverts those emails, that diverts those calls away from their inbox? Make sure that if they're going to leave and they want their wages redirecting, make sure that that's as easy and, you know, stress-free as possible to get their wages redirected to a different bank account. Don't let anyone who is experiencing domestic abuse loan work, you know, for obvious reasons. Perhaps getting security or someone to walk them to their car and walk them into the office or the factory. Or I know that Shagufta was telling me last week at Blackpool Hospital, Jane Clough was a nurse there in the A&E department. She was sadly murdered in the car park at Blackpool Royal, and now they have a security guard that will walk known victims of domestic abuse to and from their car. to prevent that happening again. So is that something that, you know, that can happen at your workplace? Record, I know I keep coming back to the notes and the recording, but it really is so important, you know, for these incidents. If someone turns up at work and you know that his or her victim of abuse works at your place of work, just record it. Just put a little note down that he or she arrived at work, and make sure you know organisations that can help with signposting to get these people the proper help that they need. So I've put on here there's a couple of apps there. So the Bright Sky app is very, very good. It has a whole array of information on there, signs and what to look out for and what is abuse, the different types of abuse. You can also, in that, put in your postcode or your town, and you will find services local to your area that can provide help and support and refuge. And the HollyGuard app, that is that's a stalking app. It can alert. You can name someone on the app to be alerted. If you shake your phone, if you're in trouble or in danger, you can shake your phone and that person will be alerted that you need help, and they will be sent your exact location. So that's quite a protective app as well. Working from home, I know before we started today we were chatting about working from home and how potentially going forward there's going to be certainly a split. You know, some people may well be returning to the office full time, but a lot of people won't. So if you are concerned about one of your employees, make sure that there's some kind of daily contact. Don't leave it for days without getting in touch with this person and just kind of touching base. Empower your line managers. Make sure your line managers know what your policy is on domestic abuse, where they can go for help and support to pass that support down to the employee. Give them all the tools they need to help that person and support them as much as they can. Perhaps put those apps that I've just mentioned on work phones as a default. You know, if they're on there, they're easily found. Certainly the Bright Sky one can be disguised to look like just a weather app. So perhaps they can go on there as default. If you have an intranet, put the links to those apps on there, link prominently to your domestic abuse policy. Again, so as everyone on your workforce knows exactly how your company feels about domestic abuse and what they're prepared to do to support someone. Also put a link to your local domestic abuse service. A quick link, make friends with your local domestic abuse service. You know, we're a nice lot. So make friends with us and you know, put a link to our service on there or the service that is in your area. So if someone does make a disclosure to you, obviously there are certain obligations around safeguarding and confidentiality. So again, make sure conversations take place in private. Don't let anyone overhear this. All it can take is for a perpetrator of abuse to get a little snippet of information, and you know, it can cause further abuse. So make sure that all these conversations take place in private. Again, I'm going to say it again, accurate notes. It's that important. It really is. Reaffirm to whoever's making the disclosure about confidentiality, that reassure them that details are only going to be shared with people within the organisation that need to know, that have a role in supporting them, and then ensure that even if they have a role in supporting them, do they need to know the nitty-gritty? Do they need to know everything? Probably not. You know, sometimes they only need the very basics. You know, this is this person's privacy. So you can share details with the consent of your employee. You can share sort of details with places like ourselves. You can, you know, get in touch with us. The only time that you don't have to get consent is if there is an imminent risk of harm to the employee, others, or children involved. Even so, you know, it's a good idea to try and get consent, but that is the one exception. So, you know, if someone turns up at the workplace shouting and threatening and, you know, smashing cars in the car, you are going to call the police. It's as simple as that. That's going to happen. If you are in doubt whether this is something that needs to be shared with either the police or, say, children's services, pick up the phone. You will be given that guidance. You don't have to name names. You can say that this is the issue that I have. Can someone please give me some advice? So 111 is the non-emergency police number. Your local children's social care will have a CADS team or an initial assessment team that will be able to give you some guidance. Or again, ring your local domestic abuse service. We get telephone calls asking for guidance regularly, and we are more than happy to help people support other people and try and protect other people. So pick up the phone, definitely. This is a very brief sort of snapshot of the services that we can offer at the Wish Centre. So we do have two refuges. We wouldn't normally house people from Blackburn in a Blackburn refuge because that defeats the object of, you know, trying to keep someone safe. So victims of domestic abuse are usually moved out of area to a refuge that is safe for them. IDVAs, we do have IDVAs, and we do have a specialist stalking advocate as well. She's an Isaac. So IDVA stands for Independent Domestic Violence Advocate, and they are your voice at meetings with the police. So the local MARIC meeting, which is again a large meeting. All services in the area are involved to ensure the safety of that victim and any children involved. Most services offer counselling. Now, when it comes to counselling, a lot of services are just available 9 to 5. As an employer, would you be prepared for someone to take time for counselling if they'd experienced domestic abuse? So that's something, you know, that you can think about as well. A lot of services offer support for children, and referring back to perpetrators of abuse, a lot of services, there are services in areas for domestic abuse perpetrators. They are going to become more prevalent in the Domestic Abuse Act. Certain provisions were made that domestic abuse perpetrator programs were to be more widely available. And of course the police, should they choose to report it. But one thing I will say is it is their choice. If they say, no, I am not ready to report this to the police, that choice has to be respected. There's just a couple of websites here that will help and give you guidance. This has really been a whistle-stop tour of what is available and what you can do. But these two websites here, the Domestic Abuse Toolkit, that has been updated for COVID, and the one on that link, there are others floating about that is the old copy. But the one on that link there is the one that's been updated in June this year to include advice around COVID and Domestic Abuse Bill Act. And you can always do a corporate partnership with your local specialist service, and become involved with your local provider. And if you want to learn more about our work, we're on all social media, and that is our website there. If you have any questions that you want to direct personally to either myself or Shagufta, there are email addresses there. And that's it. Thank you very much for having me.
Thanks very much, Rebecca. Really appreciate that insight into what the Wish Centre to do, and obviously the issues around domestic abuse and how employers can support that. I'll just run through some of our slides just to deal with it from a HR employment perspective, sharing with you some ACAS guidance, CIPD guidance, and some guidance from the Equality and Human Rights Commission. And then we'll move on to some Q&A. I should say that obviously the Wish Centre are a charity. If any of you would want to personally provide a donation, or your organisations will be willing to make a donation, that'd be massively appreciated. They do some fabulous work locally supporting victims of domestic abuse. So what I wanted to do now is just quickly run through some of the additional stuff from our perspective. So if we can just move on to the agenda, Kane, please. So I'm just going to cover, obviously, very briefly, the definition of domestic abuse, have a quick look at the impacts of the COVID pandemic. The government's report and open letter that was issued in January this year, which is essentially really sort of increased the profile of an employer's responsibility around domestic abuse, building awareness and understanding of domestic abuse within the workplace, how it can manifest itself in the workplace, what are the telltale signs, looking at the support mechanisms that we can give in the workplace. This will overlap with some of the stuff that Rebecca's covered off. Looking at the employment rights of individuals, just touching upon the health and safety obligations from a legal perspective, and then having a look at those guidances from ACAS, CIPD and EHRC, and then having a look at what the future might look like as well. So if we just move on, Kane, please. In terms of the domestic abuse definition, I think Rebecca covered it off pretty well, to be honest. But just to be clear, there is a Domestic Abuse Bill 2021, which contains a statutory definition, which covers behaviour that can be physical or sexual and involve violence or threats, but it can also take the form of psychological control, etc., that coercive behaviour, that economic abuse, etc. So it's quite a wide definition, and whilst you can sort of come up with things that fall within that, I'm sure there's lots of other sort of activities or scenarios that could easily be caught as well. Okay, if you just pass on. I think one of the reasons this came to the government's attention is that the there's reports from sort of local, well not local, from national organisations that support victims of domestic violence, that the amount of support that was being requested from people throughout the pandemic since lockdown last year significantly increased over the last sort of 12 months. In fact, Refuge have seen an increase of 65% in demand to their helpline and a 700% increase in visits to their website as well, which just gives you a feel for what's going on in the background. And if you take into consideration what Rebecca said about the workplace being a safe place, and the fact that many staff were actually sent home to work from home where it isn't safe, then you can understand why there's been such a surge in this demand for these services from domestic abuse organisations. So it's a real issue, and on the back of it, the government published a report called the Workplace Support for Victims of Domestic Abuse on the 14th of January, and they issued that in an open letter to employers, which outlines several practical steps which you as employees can take to build awareness of domestic abuse and ensuring that you're noticing the sort of the telltale signs and helping workers access support where possible. Key highlights of that open letter are raising awareness of domestic abuse within the organisation, making sure that number one, victims, well, if you think about 1 in 3 women are victims of domestic abuse, then there's certainly going to be members of your staff that are subject to domestic abuse. So making them aware that you're there to help and support them and guide them and signpost them, but also making sure that your other colleagues who might not be victims are aware of the telltale signs of domestic abuse, that line managers are trained to spot the signs of domestic abuse, and that they can hopefully step in and have confidential discussions with the employee to see what support can be given. So the more aware staff are, the more likely people will take the help that is available to them. Don't overcomplicate it. This isn't something that is limited to large organisations. Every employer, regardless of size, can put something in place, and particularly if you use the free sort of helpline, website such as IDA, which provides free membership and access to toolkits for employers, free template policies, etc. It can easily be done. So don't overcomplicate it. It can be kept fairly simple. And make sure it's inclusive. So anyone can suffer domestic abuse, and it can be especially difficult to ask for help if you have to disclose information about your personal life at work. Senior leaders should look to foster an environment where all workers feel comfortable being themselves and talking openly, and allowing survivors to feel they can be open with their senior leaders. Ask what you can offer. So this isn't about you sort of having to dictate how you're going to support them. It's understanding from the victim as to what support you can offer them, how you can help them deal with the challenges that they've got in their personal life, and sort of maybe helping them signpost them to organisations that can help. They might be afraid to take that first step to contact an independent organisation that can help, and you could be that bridge between them and that organisation. So find out what help they want, make them aware of what help is on offer, and then they can help choose the support that they need. Make your support clear to all, which fits in with what I've just said. Involve experts. I don't think any of us are experts, apart from Shagufta and Rebecca and her colleagues at the Wish Centre, and obviously similar colleagues in other organisations that specialise in domestic abuse. We're not experts, we're not expected to be experts. The most important thing is that we have a process in place that allows us to provide support, allows us to signpost these victims, and that the employee, your employee, feels that they've had that support. And as I mentioned before, there's lots of free support available sort of from various organisations. So Business in the Community, which Rebecca mentioned, Public Health England have some information on it, and the Employers Initiative on Domestic Abuse is a very useful website with quite a good toolkit. So I definitely recommend going onto that website. Okay, Kane, next slide. The report that was published by the government sort of talks about building an awareness and understanding of domestic abuse. An effective employer response is based on more awareness and better understanding, spotting the signs of abuse, knowing how to respond to a disclosure from a member of staff or colleague. It can be really difficult to know what to do unless you've got that policy in the background that sort of makes people understand what the steps are that they can take to help staff, and hopefully had some training on it as well. And knowing how to signpost to domestic abuse and victim organisations is really important. Okay. In terms of telltale signs, just to have a think about, what might be the telltale signs of a victim of domestic abuse in your organisation. Clearly, one obvious sign is that they might well confide in a colleague or a manager, but the important thing is ensuring that that colleague or manager knows about any policy you've got, and they can encourage that colleague to then go and take appropriate support from you as the employer. There will be obvious effects such as physical abuse or pain, facial bruising on the hands or the arms, or sort of other sorts of signs that they're in pain themselves, whatever it could be. a drop in performance or standards, service standards. Quite often it might be easy to jump in and sort of challenge them as to why they're not performing at the level they're performing. But if they've got all this going on in their personal life, then it's understandable that that's going to impact upon the performance. And sometimes we don't want to pry too much. If there is an employee that's underperforming and they say they've got a lot going on in their personal life, I think line managers would tend to not want to delve too deep because they fear that they're intruding in someone's private life. But again, it's making sure that you have that open conversation where an employee feels safe that they can make that disclosure to their line manager about what actually is going on in their personal life, so we can then facilitate that support. Changes in employees' behaviour, where they might become erratic, or withdrawn. So it's looking for those telltale signs. Poor attendance could be an indicator. And that highlights the importance of having your return to work interviews, and making sure return to work interviews, again, are sort of not just a tick box exercise, but designed to try and understand what's causing the individual to be off sick. Are there any issues going on at home that are creating that, where we can provide some support? On the reverse, we might have issues of presenteeism. People don't want to go home because the workplace is that safe place. And so people who are working long hours and not going home, we need to sort of have a conversation with them that, number one, working such long hours isn't healthy for them, but is there a reason, why they are working such long hours? If it's workload, then clearly we can address it. But if they don't have that workload that is resulting in them working such long hours, then we've got to query what is it that prevented them from going home. Depression, sleep deprivation, loss of appetite, and then just sometimes changes in the way an employee dresses. So they may well excess clothing on warm days, or change the amount of makeup that they're wearing, or come in wearing a scarf, for example, which would be unusual. So it's just trying to spot the telltale signs that might be a sign that someone is experiencing some domestic abuse at home. Okay, next slide, Kane. In terms of support in the workplace, I think sort of Rebecca covered it off really well in her slides. This just simply reiterates it. It's about recognition of the problem, believing the victim's story, and ensuring that they consent to any further steps that you may take on their behalf. Signposting them to specialist services, clear and visible policy. Ensure it's embedded into your wider organisation culture. Look at domestic abuse champions. It's interesting that the local safeguarding boards in your areas will provide that kind of training, so certainly look that up. Provide training to line managers and HR about the policy and what they can do to help implement that policy within their teams and across the organisation, and understanding the role of senior management and leadership. Ultimately, if you do put a domestic abuse policy in place, then the government's report suggests that the following should be included, so that it's as informative as possible. So we're looking at including the signs of domestic abuse, the roles and responsibilities of individuals within the organisation to deal with it, education and training of staff, steps that can be taken to ensure safety in the workplace, what the employer can practically offer in terms of financial assistance, flexibility in their working arrangements, and any access to paid leave. Practical steps an employer can take, including paying salaries into separate accounts, providing access to counselling or other health-related services, and providing time and space within work for victims to make calls and make other arrangements. Also, practical steps that employers can take to ensure the safety in and around their workplace. Looking at putting in place a safety plan. I asked a question of Shagufta on the chat box as to whether or not their advocates can come to workplace meetings to support their the victim of domestic abuse, and whether they would help with a safety plan. And Shagufta confirmed that yes, they could do that. So certainly contacting your local organisation that supports victims of domestic abuse might be a good starting point to help with those kind of safety plans. And employers should make clear that their approach to any abusers or employees showing abusive behaviour in the workplace will be dealt with robustly, as Rebecca mentioned, some of the case with them, I think it was Christina, involved a colleague, well, it involved her partner in the workplace as well. You know, so employers need to spot that, and where there is an issue, they need to deal with it quickly and robustly. Okay, next slide. In terms of employment rights, just sort of things to point out, there currently isn't any legislation that entitles victims of domestic abuse in the workplace to special leave. Whether or not that's something the government will introduce in the future, we'll have to wait and see. I do know that there are countries across the world that actually have legislation in place that entitles employees to domestic abuse leave. So it's something that might crop up, but there's nothing preventing you as an employer from offering access to discretionary special leave, particularly because you'll find that victims of domestic abuse will often have used up their holiday entitlement to deal with the arrangements that they're trying to put in place as a result of the effects of domestic violence. So that might be moving, relocating their, where they live, going to counselling sessions, going to other health sessions to help with any depression or anxiety. They may well be taking holiday leave to cover all that up because they don't want you to know about it. So looking at whether you can facilitate access to special leave, paid or unpaid, is certainly something to explore. We know that employees have a right to flexible working. That applies to all staff, and this equally applies to victims of domestic violence. So certainly an employee who is subject to domestic abuse should be encouraged to apply for flexible working if they believe that changes to the work arrangements could give them improved safety. Temporary adjustments to working patterns or location will probably be covered by flexible working anyway, but it's certainly something you would need to explore as part and parcel of a safety plan, particularly if they are vulnerable at their workplace. Remember that the perpetrator will usually know where that individual works, and it's often they'll know the work pattern, so they'll often know when they can catch that person leaving the workplace to stalk them, harass them, or abuse them. So it's being alive to that and making sure we have those discussions with our employees that need that support. Unfair dismissal and discrimination. Certainly, if you fail to deal with a scenario of an employee that is a victim of domestic abuse effectively, and you fail to put into place the appropriate health and safety sort of mechanisms to protect them in the workplace, perhaps from an abuser, then you could potentially create a scenario of constructive unfair dismissal because you're failing to fulfill your obligations to them as an employee. Likewise, if you're actually looking at dismissing a perpetrator of domestic abuse, then we need to ensure we stay on the right side of what is a fair dismissal and go through a full and proper process. Discrimination, I suppose, if we look at the statistics, of 1 in 3 women are victims of domestic abuse. That means that it is more likely than not that women will be the ones that are coming looking for flexible working, for temporary adjustments or permanent adjustments to their workplace. And if we are not supporting and facilitating that where we reasonably can do, then potentially that could result in some kind of indirect sex discrimination. So something just to have a think about there. We do have a duty of care as an employer. We must remember that when they are at work, we have that responsibility of protecting their health, safety and welfare. And so we've got to think about that safety plan, which will facilitate and support victims of domestic abuse being safe in the workplace. And then reasonable adjustments, I put that in there because lots of victims regrettably will suffer mental health issues as a result of the trauma that they've been through over probably a sustained period of time, and it's likely therefore that they could be covered by the definition of a disability and therefore have the right to make a request for reasonable adjustments, and the failure to do so could result in some liability. So I just wanted to flag where the legal issues might come into play here. Okay, next slide. Okay. I've touched upon the health and safety aspect of this. I'm not going to cover it, just apart from reiterating that important thing to do a safety plan, a risk assessment when someone comes and makes a disclosure to you, so you are fulfilling your obligations. Okay, thank you. I think these next 3 slides, and we will share the slides afterwards, ACAS, CIPD and the Equality of Human Rights Commission all sort of say very similar things, and they probably reiterate what I've already said and what Rebecca's already said, so I'm not going to spend much time on these. I'll simply send the slides to you afterwards so you've got access to them. Okay. So what could the future look like? Well, we know that the government is introducing the Domestic Abuse Bill, and that they've got a wider programme of work with the purpose of prevention of abuse and protection of survivors. So the government has already stated that it's going to consult to take forward a manifesto commitment to encourage flexible working. And actually they're exploring the possibility of making flexible working the default entitlement unless an employer has a good reason not to implement that flexible working. So it's shifting the balance in favour of the employee and putting the onus on the employer to have a good reason to reject that request, which will then make it much easier for victims of domestic abuse to get the flexibility that they need to deal with the challenges in their lives. And they're also going to consult on steps which can be taken for victims of domestic abuse, for example, how to exercise their existing rights more effectively. But I thought it'd be just useful to have a look at what other countries do, because inevitably, you know, our government will look at what other governments do around the world to get inspiration and ideas. And bizarrely, I got a contract of employment from a client that's based in New Zealand a couple of weeks ago, and I was flicking through the employment contract, and in the employment contract was a specific section dedicated to domestic violence, which confirmed that there is a Domestic Violence Victims Protection Act 2018, which imposes some obligations on employers to comply with rights that employees will have in these scenarios. And essentially it protects those affected during employment or who was affected prior to joining. And it gives the employees the right to request short-term, 2 months or less, variation to working arrangements to assist in dealing with the effects of domestic violence, and also 10 days domestic violence leave in any 12-month period. So that's what New Zealand does. Australia isn't as sort of wide-ranging as that. Australia entitles employees who are victims of domestic abuse to 5 days unpaid leave each year in order to access the support they need. In California, their Labour Code 230, all employees who are 25, all employers with more than 25 staff must provide a victim of domestic abuse leave from work when requested. And once a request has been made, the employer then has an obligation to make reasonable accommodation or reasonable adjustments, which can include changing the work schedule, installing locks on employees' doors, changing work telephone numbers, changing email addresses, transfer to a different job or location, and any other changes that the employee might reasonably request to protect them whilst at work. And importantly, in California, there is no retaliation is permitted against any employee that makes a request under that legislation for support. So they've got protection once they've made that request. So I think I can see this developing in the UK over the course of the next 12 months to 2 years, where actually there will be more specific rights that are given to victims of domestic violence, particularly if, as Sri Gupta told me before this meeting started, the numbers of victims of domestic violence is increasing and has significantly increased. If that continues, then inevitably the government then asks employers to step in and try to support in their battle against this problem. Okay, thanks, Kay. And then finally, just before I sort of move on to helpful links, NAPFINS do actually have a domestic abuse policy in place, and it covers many of the stuff we've talked about. So it talks about the confidentiality and right to privacy around disclosures made by victims of domestic abuse, the fact that we'll be referring them to a specialist in that area and that we're not experts, that we sort of will set out or detail in that policy, or we do detail in that policy, the support links to charitable organisations and other organisations that can provide advice and support to them by way of signposting them, making it clear that only named disclosures around a disclosure that's being made to us as the employer, we can only disclose that to an authority in exceptional circumstances, and that's where there's serious risk to that individual or to the children, which Rebecca touched upon. And then we set out a long list of support that's available to any employees that are subject to domestic abuse, and it goes right through the list of flexible working, redeployment, changing email addresses, changing telephone numbers, no loan working, safety planning, including, I hadn't come across this word before, sort of what DASH, it's sort of domestic abuse, stalking and harassment, and honour-based violence risk assessment. I think that's right. Is it Shagufta? Something like that. So we would carry out that risk assessment for anyone that makes a disclosure to us, so that we're fulfilling our obligations. I'm going to leave that list of helpful links on there for you to digest in your own time, and say we'll get the slides across to you. And I think on that note, I'm going to sort of invite any questions. Okay, do you want to see if there's any live questions first, and then we'll move on to the questions that are in the chat box?
No live questions at the minute, Ollie.
Okay.
Betsy's asked, with many staff now working from home, what suggestions do you have to support people who may be living with domestic abuse and working in that way?
Well, I'll give it my spin, and then Shagufta might, or Shagufta or Rebecca might jump in. I think obviously, I think we mentioned at the outset that the pandemic's changed the way a lot of businesses work, and a lot of businesses are looking at this agile working policy. I must have a number of emails already in my inbox about clients looking to switch to that. And that potentially presents a problem for victims of domestic abuse, because if you have a fixed policy where you will, for example, work 3 days in the office, 2 days at home, you might be forcing those employees into what they see as an unsafe place at home. So we need to just think about any agile policy we're putting in place, that it allows people to actually apply to work full-time from work, that they're not going to be forced to working from home, and they have the opportunity to come into work, because that could be the safe place. But if we are going to permit working from home, we do need to carry out that general health and safety risk assessment anyway. But if we have someone who makes a disclosure that they are victims of domestic abuse, then we would definitely have to do a full sort of safety plan and risk assessment as to how they can work safely at home if the perpetrator is in that environment. And if they are, then we'd have to look at what steps we can do to bring them out of that work environment, essentially. Shagufta, I don't know if you've got anything to add to that.
I was just going to make a suggestion on on one of the things that you shared, Oliver, about a code word. A code word is a really, really useful way of making sure that you know that employee, when they're speaking to you, are safe to do so, and the perpetrator is not present. So that is something that could be done, and that obviously would have to be done with the employee in the office, where you can speak to them. And perhaps if you're looking at agile working or a hybrid approach, making sure that employee is regularly in work and not just home working would be a safe thing to do. So those two considerations are potentially helpful. And then encouraging the employee. I think somebody asked a question in the chat just now about, how do you approach that conversation with an employee? And I was just made a suggestion on there to say that, ask them if they feel safe at home, ask them if everything's okay, and don't expect them to give you a response straight away. It might be that they don't feel safe to do so at that time, or don't feel confident to do so at the time, but they know that you're interested, they know that you're concerned. We've had victims come to us and say something as simple as, I went into work, or I went to even a GP, and I had a visible injury, and they didn't ask me what it was. Either the workplace didn't ask me what happened, or even the doctor hasn't asked me, why you sat there with a visible injury. If you ask the question, that person then knows that you're interested, and it might not be a visible injury. I'm just giving that as an example. And it's a very blatant example where somebody's not been asked the question. But if you know that the employee's behaviour is changing and you're not questioning it, then you're showing that you're not interested. So just showing concern will open that door up. And what Rebecca suggested before about having a workplace policy, having something on your intranet, knowing, team managers knowing that there is a policy there, your employees know that you're concerned as an organisation. That is really helpful.
Thank you, Shagufta. I think there's another question for the Wish Centre here. What is the best way for an employer to approach a conversation with an employee about suspected domestic abuse? So you see the telltale signs.
Yeah, that's what I was just referring to, Oliver. I've given an answer in there, but yes, just ask the question. Ask them. Yeah, ask them. Are you okay? Are you safe at home? Is there anything that's bothering you? Is there anything that's concerning you? And just be patient with them, because it might take a while to open up and make a disclosure.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. And another one that came across my desk a few weeks ago, actually, which was actually a mother. Our client's employee was the mother who was, we believe, being controlled by the son, and he was essentially monitoring her emails, taking over control of her emails. He was sort of, she was having a lot of absence issues, but he wanted to sort of be coming to the meetings, etc. And the employer was quite concerned about this employee's welfare at home. And the question that they asked is, at what stage do we sort of report it to the police if we've got a concern, or can we not report it to the police? Should we sort of try to get that consent from the employee to do that?
It's always difficult when it's a parent and child scenario, because you know, if it's a partner, you can encourage the employee and empower them to make that report to the police and make that decision to report that abuse that's going on. With a mother and son situation, and we've come across that quite a lot, it's very challenging, because that parent is always going to be a parent, and they're very reluctant to report that abuse to the police and criminalize the young person, and it could be an adult and not even a young person perpetrating that abuse. But I think in that scenario, if a threat has been made, if it's a threat to life, you have to report that to the police. There is no two ways about it. If it's not a threat to life, then I think in just encouraging and empowering that person that this is abusive behavior, this is something that is impacting on your work and your life, and we're here to support you. You know, we'll empower them to hopefully leave that abusive situation. But it's very challenging with parent and child. Yeah. Is there anything you want to add, Rebecca? Do you think I've covered everything?
No. Yeah. Excuse me. No, I think like you say, it is very, very difficult when it's parent-child, because of that criminalisation of, you know, if it's reported to the police. But certainly encouragement and giving helpful websites and links to agencies where, you know, and making it very clear that the police, if they come to somewhere like the Wish, the police do not have to be involved with that, you know.
Yeah. Just to add as well, Oliver, that if it's a young person, 18 or under, then we are delivering programs. So the Wish Centre is delivering programs across Blackburn and Darwen, across Lancashire, across Blackpool, where there is adolescent to parent violence going on. So we will work with the family. If it's an adult child, so above the age of 18, then sadly that's not something that we can do a program with, but we can certainly support that victim in that situation.
That's great to know, because I was saying, you know, quite a lot of sort of parents, sometimes actually the abuse they're experiencing is coming from those adolescent children, you know, particularly male children, which can be really difficult for them to control. So it's good to know that there is support out there for both the victim, but also the child that perhaps just needs their behaviour correcting in the right way. Just have a look if there's other questions. I think one thing that's just sort of a theme that's come through out of all this, and where employers can certainly make sure that they're at sort of available for these kind of discussions to take place, is that communication within the workplace is absolutely key, and the role of line managers and senior leaders is going to be key. And the best chance of spotting the signs or facilitating the disclosure from someone who's a victim of domestic abuse is to have regular conversations with your employees. So, you know, when you have absences, those return to work interviews are so important. But let's also have your normal one-to-ones where you're just having a catch-up with your employees to see how they are, what's going on in their lives, how's work, any problems at work, etc., which can be part of the general day-to-day performance management or performance development review anyway. But if you have those regular conversations, you're in a much better chance to capture this and to step in with early intervention and signpost people to the support that they need. So I definitely encourage employers to try and ensure that there's a regular communication between team leaders and their team underneath them to ensure that they have that opportunity to capture these issues and support staff where they need it. Any other questions, Kane?
No, I think that's them all, Ollie.
Great. Okay, right. Well, I'd firstly like to thank everybody for attending today. Apologies, we've run over by 6 minutes. But hopefully it was worthwhile. We will distribute these slides afterwards so that you've all got the slides and access to all the links and the useful information that was in both sets of slides. And just a really big thank you to Shagufta and to Rebecca for joining us today. It really is an important topic. We as employers have a real opportunity to make a difference to people's lives by making sure that we implement some of the stuff that we've talked about today. So please do go away and have a look at what you can do. If you need any help or support, by all means speak to us, pick up the phone to Shagufta or Rebecca, and I'm sure they'll give you a steer or guidance on what you can do in the workplace to to help. And likewise, facilitating training, they might be able to direct you as to where training can be accessed internally, but also for any domestic abuse champions. So without further ado, thank you very much and have a great day. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.